When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement. I don't really know why. Most people are more scared of basements, but there was something about our attic that really frightened me. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was a little different from what you are probably imagining. First of all, it was surprisingly big. Most attics are usually tight and crowded, which makes sense. But our attic was built in a way where you never had to bend down when you were up there. You might think that means we use it more often, the same way people use extra space. But no, I'm not really sure why. But my parents treated it like a fancy storage room. That was its only purpose. Looking back now, they honestly avoided it as much as possible. Another thing about it was that it had so many little corners and hidden spaces built into it. What I mean is that the space was split up by strange beams and small changes in height, almost like a homemade maze. The beams were all different sizes, and there was no pattern to where they were placed. Because of that, you couldn't stand in one spot and clearly see from one end of the attic to the other. And the uneven floor was terrible. You could seriously hurt yourself up there if you weren't careful. My dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on a beam, fall through the insulation, and crash through the ceiling. So, you can probably understand why an attic like that would scare a little kid. The maze-like feeling was what scared me the most. I really hated not being able to see the whole attic, and every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of the beams. But anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't remember much else from that time in my life. For some reason, though, this memory is so clear that it feels like a sharp thorn sticking into what was otherwise a great childhood. It happened during the school week, which I remember because I had school that day. I'm not exactly sure how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and filthy, and there was this fine layer of dirt between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I had just gone to bed, fallen asleep, and woken up with dirty feet. Being a little kid, I didn't think too much about it after that. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and continued with my day. But things only got worse after that. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was a small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs, and when I asked my mom about it, she just assumed I had been searching through the attic for some reason. I told her I hadn't, but she didn't seem worried. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was it. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing that I vaguely remember from the attic. This time I knew for sure that I hadn't brought it downstairs. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through the house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it belonged there. That's when things started making sense. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me right away, but it made me feel strange. The idea that I was walking through that maze of beams and uneven floors in the dark without knowing what I was doing felt weird. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you would expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I would probably grow out of it. I wouldn't say they ignored it, but they weren't very worried either. To them, it was just one of those things. But to me, it felt like much more than that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I would lie in bed for hours after I was supposed to be asleep, trying to stay awake, because I was terrified of what might happen once I fell asleep. Obviously, I couldn't stay awake forever. And every morning I would quickly check my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, but those few times when they weren't really scared me. There was no denying that I was definitely going up to the attic often. And the worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it at all. For all I knew, I could have been spending more time up there than in my own bed. The fear I felt during that time was different from anything I had ever felt before. It was like a slow, creeping fear that never left. It was awful. But nothing was scarier than what I'm about to tell you. I woke up one morning, except it wasn't morning. It was still dark outside. It took me a few seconds to realize it, but I wasn't in my bed either. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I noticed. I was standing upright in complete darkness, and I had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even understand it. But then I realized the truth. I was in the attic. The fear that hit me was so strong that I could barely breathe. I was in the attic, in the middle of the night, in total darkness. I couldn't see a single thing. Not the beams, not the boxes, not the attic door. Nothing. Just complete blackness. And to make things even worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was standing. I stood there for what felt like forever, too scared to move. It felt like sleep paralysis times 100. I knew the layout of the attic, but only a little and only from memory. I also knew there were obstacles everywhere. The thought of trying to find my way back to the attic door in complete darkness felt almost impossible, but I couldn't stand there forever. So I started moving slowly and carefully. I was so scared that I actually started crying, but silently. Tears were running down my face, and I felt like if I made too much noise, something would get me. It was the most terrified I have ever been, but I couldn't stop feeling like I wasn't alone up there. I don't know why I thought that, but I could feel something else there with me. Something deeper in the darkness. And as soon as I had that thought, I heard something. There was a soft thump somewhere behind me. Honestly, it sounded like a footstep or someone shifting their weight on the floor. I kept moving, but I heard the sound 2 more times. And both times it sounded like it came from a different place. At that point, I was completely sure there was something else up there with me. I don't know how long it took me to find the attic door, but I finally found it. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up. By then I was crying uncontrollably. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them what had happened, how I had to find my way back in the dark. I told them about the sounds too, and that there was someone in the attic. I expected my dad to jump out of bed and run upstairs with a baseball bat, but he didn't. They didn't really take me seriously. My mom just hugged me and told me it was okay, that sleepwalking could feel scary, but it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic door if it would make me feel better, and of course I said yes. But I knew what I had heard. I begged them to at least check the attic, and my dad finally agreed. As I watched my dad climb up there, part of me honestly thought he wasn't going to come back down. But less than 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the ladder. He told me there was nothing up there and to go back to sleep. So that's what I did. But lying in bed after that experience was the worst night of my life. After that, the sleepwalking stopped. I'm not sure what I would have done if it had continued. And honestly, I've never fully accepted the sleepwalking explanation. I know it's the most logical explanation. Sleepwalking is real, and there's nothing supernatural about it. But part of me still can't let it go. The way I always ended up in the same place, the attic, and nowhere else in the house. And the way I was somehow able to move through that maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without hurting myself. And most of all, that night when I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard still make me believe there was something else up there with me. I truly believe that. What it was, I have no idea. I'm obviously much older now, and I brought these concerns up to my parents several times, but they always give me the same dismissive answers. It almost feels like they don't want to think about it either, which also doesn't make much sense to me. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. This happened when I was 14 or 15 years old. My family lived in this old house that had been passed down through generations. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him. I don't live there anymore, but I still think about what I'm about to tell you from time to time. Like most houses, it had an attic. It was basically a graveyard for things nobody wanted to deal with, like old furniture, boxes filled with who knows what, and Christmas decorations. That last one was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year before the holidays, and then once more to put everything back. This happened around Christmas time, but Christmas really has nothing to do with the story. That Christmas, my dad decided I was finally old enough to get the decorations myself. He explained everything to me, which boxes to look for, something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall, and I nodded like I was listening carefully, but I really wasn't. I was thinking about something else. We finished talking, and he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the ladder and pulled the little chain to turn on the light. I remember looking around and realizing I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. But then I realized there was a problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had told me to get. I couldn't remember any of his instructions, and there was no way I was going back downstairs to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. He would get really angry if you made him say something twice. So I just started opening random boxes that looked like they might have Christmas decorations inside. I moved things around for probably 20 minutes, and I ended up making a huge mess. I finally found the Christmas decorations, which saved me from the stress of going downstairs empty-handed. But the attic was completely messy by then. I made 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, carrying everything to the living room. Once I was done, I went back up one last time to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. I knew I was going to have to organize everything again, which I really didn't want to do. While I was looking around the attic, preparing myself to move everything back, I noticed something that looked out of place. In one of the back corners, hidden behind all the stuff I had moved, there was a box I hadn't seen before. It was black and didn't look like a weak cardboard box. It looked stronger, like a document box or one of those fireproof boxes. Even though it looked heavy duty, it somehow looked older than everything else up there. Being a curious kid, I obviously opened it. Inside were papers, dozens and dozens of them, an alarming amount. Notebooks, loose pages, some hand-drawn maps, even a few pages that looked like sheet music. And the one thing they all had in common was that every page was completely covered in handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the sheet music. I started going through everything, trying to understand what I was looking at. The handwriting was hard to read at first, but the more my eyes adjusted, the more I could understand it. None of the pages had dates, but they seemed to be stacked in order from oldest to newest. Older pages on top and newer entries near the bottom. I was so interested in that box and those papers that I told myself I wouldn't go downstairs until I had read every single one. The earliest entries were boring. Weather notes, household chores, random thoughts about the day. It looked like a messy diary, and I quickly figured out that whoever wrote it had once lived in that house. But as I kept reading, things started getting stranger. First of all, the handwriting became more messy and harder to read, which was a first sign, but that was nothing compared to the actual content. Whoever wrote it had become obsessed with the attic. They kept measuring it. Over and over again, they wrote down the size of the attic and compared it to the size of the house below. According to their math, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was empty space along one wall, several feet of space that couldn't be explained. They wrote in extreme detail about that wall. Cracks, dents, marks. Every tiny detail that made the wall different was written down. The entries became even more frantic after that. From what I read, it was obvious that whoever wrote them was spending hours in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there. They started hearing sounds coming from behind that missing space, scratching, breathing, things like that. Some entries even had exact times written next to them, like 2:14 a.m. scratching for about 3 minutes. The more I read, the more I realized I was reading a first-hand story about someone slowly losing their mind. None of it sounded normal, and I didn't believe a word of it, but it only got worse. The final pages weren't even full sentences anymore, just tally marks. Rows and rows of them, counting something I couldn't understand. And then the entries suddenly stopped. Either the person stopped writing, or that was the end of the records. By the time I finished reading everything, I was honestly shaking. I wanted to put everything back where I found it, go downstairs, and completely forget that I had ever read any of it. But there was one thing I had to do first. My eyes immediately went to the wall the writer had been so obsessed with, and the moment I noticed there really were marks on it, I started feeling sick. I looked closely at the wall, and some of the dents and cracks matched almost exactly what the writer had described. It was the creepiest feeling I had ever experienced. The only way I can describe it is feeling like I was being watched from many different directions. I could picture that man scratching at the attic wall in a fit of madness. It felt like he was there in the attic with me. Suddenly, I didn't want to stay up there another second. I grabbed the black box and went straight to my dad. He was just as shocked as I was. He had no idea what any of it meant, and he had definitely never seen it before. He told me he was completely sure it wasn't his father's handwriting, which meant whoever wrote those entries must have lived there even before my grandfather. The problem was that both of his parents had already passed away, and he knew nothing about the people who lived in the house before them. My dad went upstairs to investigate, and to my surprise, he took me with him. I felt much safer with him there, so I didn't argue. I stood to the side while my dad carefully inspected the wall, even more closely than I had, using some of the pages as a guide. After a few minutes, he suddenly froze like he was thinking deeply. I thought he had given up, but then he turned to me and said he was going to tear the wall down. I was honestly shocked by that, but I wasn't about to stop him. So that's exactly what he did. He tore down the wall using some tools from the garage, and what we saw behind it was shocking. The writer had been right. There really was a hidden space back there, and it was huge. It was several feet deep and stretched across the entire wall. But that wasn't even the worst part. The walls inside the hidden space were covered in markings. Black lines, symbols, shapes I didn't even recognize. They covered almost every surface. I honestly don't know how to explain it, but those markings felt completely wrong. They didn't even look like writing. But the meaning behind it was even worse, because my dad and I soon realized there was no other entrance into that hidden space. So, how could someone have gotten in there in the first place? My dad and I just stood there feeling completely overwhelmed by what we were seeing. Eventually, after the shock wore off a little, we checked the space carefully and confirmed there was nothing else inside it. And there wasn't. The whole hidden room was empty, except for whatever had been drawn all over the walls. Things didn't end there, though. The more we thought about everything, the less sense it made. At one point, my dad pointed out that whoever wrote those notebooks, whoever had been obsessed with recording every little detail, did not seem like the kind of person who would neatly organize everything into a box and hide it away in a corner. People with obsessive behavior usually don't carefully organize things like that. I hadn't thought about that until he mentioned it, but I had to admit he was right. But that could only mean someone else had collected all the papers together. My dad understood before I did. I watched this strange expression appear on his face. It looked like sadness mixed with confusion. He stayed quiet for a while, then said it must have been his father, my grandfather. He must have found the writings at some point, collected them together, and stored them in that box. There really wasn't much else we could do after that. Years later, my dad admitted that the fact his father had hidden something like that from him, and the question of why he would do it, would always bother him forever. And honestly, I don't blame him. As for me, I still don't know what to think about any of it. It happened so long ago that I guess it doesn't matter anymore. But if I think about it for too long, I can still scare myself. I don't think anyone can explain it logically. There's no reasonable explanation. I used to think the person who wrote those entries was the same person who scratched up the hidden room, and that they were probably just insane. But there were details in those pages that someone could only know after the wall had already been built. But if the wall was already there was no other way into that space. It truly makes no sense. My dad wouldn't let me keep the box when we finally moved out of that house. For all I know, it's still sitting up there in that attic. All I know is that this is a mystery I will carry with me to my grave. I've been smoking for longer than I even want to admit. About 23 years now, more or less. At this point, it's less of a habit and more a routine. Something to keep my hands busy or to mark the end of the day. The thing is, I refuse to smoke inside the house. My parents were the same way when they lived here, even though my dad smoked cigars on special occasions. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally decided to move down to Florida. They had talked about it for years, and I think they just wanted to know the house would be in good hands before they left. I was divorced and living in an apartment that was way too small and depressing, so the timing worked out well. My only complaint now is that the house actually feels too big, which sounds ridiculous until you realize it's a 3-story colonial house, and I live alone. The house also has a huge backyard, probably almost an acre if you include the wooded area, and I've gotten used to taking late-night walks out there while I smoke. It's peaceful, There aren't any neighbors close enough to bother me, and the only light out there comes from my house. So usually it's just me, the crickets, and whatever is moving around in the trees. I usually walk around the whole property line, which takes about 10 minutes if I'm not in a hurry. I guess it's become my version of meditation. Or maybe it's just my excuse to smoke in peace. There is one important thing you need to know about the house. The house itself is extremely old. It has creaky floors, drafty windows, all that kind of stuff. It's basically impossible to walk around inside without making noise. It also has an attic that you get to using a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's basically a giant storage room, and I only go up there when I need decorations or when I need to store some of my parents' things that I don't know what to do with but also don't want to throw away. There's also a tiny window up there that looks out over the backyard. It's maybe 1 foot wide and original to the house, and it honestly looks out of place compared to the rest of the house. I've looked up at that window hundreds of times during my walks. It never caught my attention before, until about 3 weeks ago. I was doing my normal walk, halfway through a cigarette, when I happened to look up at the house. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking about the attic or anything. My eyes just drifted upward, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind that tiny window. I stopped walking and just stood there in the middle of the backyard staring up at the attic. The window was dark. Obviously, there's no light up there unless you bring a flashlight, but I was almost sure I had seen movement, maybe a shape moving past the glass or something shifting in the darkness behind it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I had just seen the reflection of a cloud or a bat flying past or something. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and forgot about it. But the next night, I saw it again. This time I knew there was definitely something moving up there, and it wasn't just a reflection or a trick of the light. Something was inside my attic. My first thought was that it was an animal. Squirrels get into old houses all the time, and I wouldn't have been surprised that there was a hole somewhere near the roof. But then I started thinking about what kind of animal would be large enough for me to see from that far away. And I didn't like any of the answers I thought of. I went back inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs looking up at the hallway where the attic ladder was. I didn't hear any scratching or running sounds. Actually, I didn't hear anything at all, which somehow made it worse. I really didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. If something was in my attic, I needed to know. So nervously, I turned on my phone flashlight and pulled down the ladder. It was especially scary because of how the attic was built. I would have to climb up without seeing anything at first. If something was waiting right above the opening, I wouldn't be able to see it. I climbed up slowly, trying to convince myself I wasn't terrified, but I was, and my fear was almost immediately proven right. I was not ready for what I saw up there. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. The attic was completely destroyed. I don't mean messy. I mean ruined. Everything was thrown everywhere. Not a single box or container was untouched, but I wasn't even focused on that. All I could think about was the black paint, or at least what looked like black paint, smeared across every wall up there, even the ceiling. It looked disturbingly thick, almost chunky, but the worst part was how wet it looked, like it had only been smeared there a few moments earlier. It was still dripping in some places, so I knew it was fresh. That first look scared me so badly that I almost fell off a ladder. I don't know why, but seeing that dripping paint terrified me so much that I felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Some crazy person was inside my house. I quickly shined my flashlight around the attic to make sure nobody was there, and that was enough for me. I practically fell down the ladder, trying to get back to the second floor. Within seconds, my fear turned into anger. I was going to find whoever did this, and I was going to protect myself. I started searching through the house, checking every room, but I found nothing. And the more I searched, the more discouraged I became. The adrenaline was wearing off too, and I was becoming scared again, which definitely didn't help. I searched the whole house and finally went back upstairs to my bedroom, thinking maybe I had missed something. But even after checking the room again, I found nothing. Then, the moment I stopped to catch my breath, I heard something. 2 loud thumps, then what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sounds came from directly above me, which could only mean one thing. The attic How stupid of me. Whoever was up there probably never left at all. They were probably hiding behind one of the overturned storage boxes. I don't know where the courage came from, but something inside me snapped. This was my parents' house, and whoever was up there had violated it. Before I could change my mind, I ran downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. And believe me, I was ready to use it. I went back upstairs and pulled the ladder down again. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold onto the ladder, but I forced myself to keep climbing. Then I started screaming like a complete madman. I burst into the attic yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the knife around like a crazy person. Part of it was anger, but honestly, most of it was fear. I stomped around the attic as aggressively as I could, throwing boxes around and screaming the whole time, but there was nobody up there. I was completely sure this time. My attic isn't very big. It's just one large space, so there's literally nowhere to hide. But there was something else up there, something new, and seeing it destroyed every bit of courage I had managed to gather. There were scratch marks everywhere, long, deep cuts in the wooden beams and floorboards, like some animal had been clawing at them. The paint from before was still there, but the scratches were carved over it, and after seeing that, I was done. I ran back downstairs to the first floor bathroom, locked myself inside, and called 911. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers went upstairs to check the attic, while I waited downstairs with a 3rd officer. When they finally came back down, all they told me was that the attic was empty. They also said they couldn't find any holes or openings anywhere up there. So whoever had destroyed my attic and terrified me must have left through the house. I insisted that their explanation made no sense. I would have heard someone leave. Like I said before, the house is incredibly creaky. Even the smallest step makes noise that I would have heard, even from 1 floor below. But there was nothing else the officers could do or tell me. So they left. It has been 3 weeks since that night, and luckily, nothing else has happened. So I guess I have no choice but to believe that some homeless person snuck into my attic, destroyed it for some reason, and left without me noticing. But the problem is, I don't believe that. I truly don't know what to think about any of this, but I refuse to believe some homeless person caused all of it. It was something worse than that. I still haven't gone back up there, not even to clean the paint. I honestly don't know what to do.